and we will now move directly into the keynote speech. I welcome up Anders Sandberg, a researcher focusing on future technologies, existential risk, and long-term societal challenges. Today, he will place cryonics in a broader system perspective with medicine, technology, and institutions. Anders, please.
There is a rule of nature that whenever you talk about some high-tech subject, immediately the audiovisuals will start failing, the mic doesn't turn on, etc. And cryonics is interesting in that regard because it's about future advanced technology that seeps into the present. And that makes it an interesting test case in many ways for thinking about the relationship between society, our institutions, how we go about doing things like medicine, funerals, insurance, and the future. That's the reason why we're here at the Institute for Future Studies. As Valdemar and Staffan pointed out, our job here is to try to help society by thinking long-term. Sometimes long-term in a domain might mean a few years. Sometimes it might be millennia. And in this case, cryonics is interesting because it also has a somewhat indefinite time span. But time is also really the core aspect of what we try to do with cryonics. So some of you might wonder what cryonics is. Probably not too many of you, because you decided it was interesting enough to come here, and probably some of you have Googled it. But the basic idea is, of course, to get sick patients to somewhere where they can actually get treatment. And the idea here is, of course, that if we cannot treat them in the present, maybe future medical technology can do that. So if you can slow down the deterioration of the body, if one could do that and put them in a form of suspended animation, then the result would be probably beneficial. We have past experience that many previously untreatable conditions have become treatable. We have an experience that various conditions that were regarded as terminal or lethal no longer are terminal or lethal, just very, very serious. So we have a reason to believe that if you could just get some patients to the future, that would be great. So in practice, what this means is to use low temperature to slow down the deterioration after death, or at least legal death, because this is, of course, going to be one of the topics that's going to come up again and again. The rather important difference between the legal death and biological death and the other forms of death that show up. Cryonics is interesting because it acts a little bit as a prism that forces these differences in our concept wider. It makes it more possible to see many of these conceptual issues. And cryonics has been a practice that has been done since the 1960s. And in many ways, it's successful. There exist organizations. The people are talking about it. There is research being done. In another sense, it's also unsuccessful because it's not terribly many people who are availing themselves to cryonics. Maybe for good reasons, maybe not. It's one of the biggest reasons is, of course, we have never ever seen a proven revival of a human or a higher mammal yet. And that is something that many people say, that makes it kind of irrational to do. Yeah, you can totally do it with nematode worms and some naturally hibernating organisms, but we're going to wait until the point where you demonstrate that in a mouse at least. Which is fair, except that, of course, by that point, you might then have asymmetric regret, because now you didn't use a technique that might actually have saved some people that you now think have a decent chance of being saved. On the other hand, being prospective about future regret also sounds like a very weird move for motivating anything. What is currently happening instead is that cryonics organizations are working on making the suspension function much better. Now, this is an interesting issue, again, from an epistemic standpoint. How do we know that a way of suspending somebody is better? How do you actually test this? How do we get knowledge about it? So that's another important issue. We have an epistemic challenge here. And it's both internal. How do we know that a different treatment will produce a better suspension? But also from a societal standpoint, how do we know that we're doing the right thing? as a patient signing up. Full disclosure, I'm signed up for it at Alcor. So, yeah. That means that at least I decided that, okay, this makes sense for me. But as a society, you might also say, yeah, we want to regulate things. We want to think about consumer protection. Can we do informed consent when we're that uncertain? What kind of practice is this? And I think from a medical standpoint, we can treat this as a prospective treatment, a pre-treatment that hopes that it can prevent worse conditions or allow a future treatment. This might sound very radical, but it's actually fairly standard in many parts of medicine. We do have umbilical cord blood banking in the hope that stem cells can actually turn out to be much more useful in the future. We have prophylactic surgery, and in the case of pediatric oncology, when you give treatments to kids, quite often that affect their fertility. So a practice that has been done since the 80s, more or less, is to take samples of gonadal tissue, freezing them in the hope that it can be reimplanted in future. When it comes to ovaries, this has been demonstrated and not regarded as very controversial. When it comes to testicular tissue, we don't know how to do this usefully yet to restore fertility. But it's still regarded, including in Sweden, as a valid medical activity. And it's exactly the same idea as cryonics. Let's freeze it and hope future technology can sort it out before too long. What makes cryonics interesting is that the timescale and magnitude of uncertainty might be much more different from other treatment. Freezing embryos for in vitro fertilization is standard practice, has been done now for decades. And very few people find it controversial, with maybe exceptions when there is an unusually long interval between conception and the actual birth. We have other forms of treatments that are more uncertain. The interesting thing is that cryonics is even more uncertain than most of the treatments we recognize. And some people might say, this is outside medicine. This is not proper medicine. It's not based on experience enough. There is some science, but not enough science. So it's something else. But if it's not medicine, then what is it? If you treat it as some form of funeral rite, you could totally do that. But then it's run by a very different set of regulations than medicine. Some people say, oh, this is religion. You're just having faith in the future. Fine. Well, if you treat cryonics as religion, it would probably be more protected than it currently is, because we have very strong protections for religious people doing strange things, including strange things to the kids' bodies. We actually have surprisingly big exceptions in bioethics for some religiously motivated interventions that would, if somebody proposed them as a form of human enhancement or lifestyle choice, we would say, hey, wait a minute, that's not going to be allowed. There is also a very common thing that says cryonics challenges our concept of death. I alluded earlier to that. I think it's challenging with our legal definition of death, perhaps more strongly than the biological one. The cryonics view is it's about information. If there is not enough information to restore you, then you're definitely dead. Then it's actually really irreversible. But there might be states where you're not animate, and those states are actually still possible to revive from, maybe. That just doesn't mean very much to a lawyer. A lawyer really wants people to exist as legal persons, and whether a legal person is dead, alive, or in some other condition, as long as you have a status that makes sense in the system, that is the important part. So the interesting part here is, of course, that cryonic patients, while they're being suspended, they are currently not legal persons, but I think many philosophers would say, yeah, they're still a kind of moral patient. We care about them. Certainly the living person had preferences about his or her future, and we generally tend to respect such preferences about the future. Maybe not as much from a person who is alive and breathing right now, but still, we do have a recognition of this, and indeed, in some cases, they can be legally binding. It's going to be an interesting question here, of course, how this might change, especially since cryonics might become a more common practice. Generally, cryonics is interesting because it's about when an intervention that is first total science fiction, extremely speculative, gradually moves closer to reality. And it went from science fiction to a practice, and then a practice that started gathering data and trying to improve procedures, doing science on reducing the obvious damage, then trying to figure out if there's non-obvious damage, trying to come up with better protocols. And it became a bigger and bigger social practice, which means that doctors are running into cryonics patients occasionally. Not that many. Compared to other forms of extending your health span, cryonics is not terribly popular. But I think it's an interesting one because of this technical aspect. Some of these aspects are also linked to other areas of medicine. One is, for example, the promise of transplant storage. Right now, we cannot store transplant organs, which creates a real medical and logistical problem, and also plenty of ethical problems about the distribution of organs. If there was a way of storing kidneys to find a suitable user, that would be fantastic. And that is a technology that's, of course, strongly linked to cryonics. Doing a cryopreservation of an organ so it can function and be put back into a body is obviously something both goals want. There are obvious links to regenerative medicine, because when we eventually try to thaw out a frozen patient, we will need to restore a lot of tissue. There is going to be a need to replace tissues and probably build an entire body, especially if you're a cheapskate like me who only decided to store his head. And this, of course, again leads to many interesting questions. There is the question, could you actually grow an entire bodies without brains and do that to get Anders back? And the ethics of that is, of course, yummy. As people who like somewhat scary bioethics, of course, love body transplants. A good thing to discuss in the seminar room. But there actually exist startups right now that are working on animal models. And yes, there are animal models, but that might, within a decade or two, mean that now we're actually having a discussion about the actual medical issues. My own area of interest, brain emulation, scanning brains and replicating the computers. Well, it's much easier to scan a frozen brain that is not moving around than a brain that is wobbling around. It might actually be that this is another way of getting out of the freezer. Again, raising tremendous philosophical questions about consciousness and personal identity and computationalism of the mind, as well as interesting scientific questions about, is there actually enough information here? Does this even make sense in the first place? Some people certainly think so. I'm mildly involved with a project of trying to scan the brain of a fruit fly and later a mouse, trying to see how much of their behavior can actually be replicated. But the interesting thing here is how society should respond when a technology creeps in like this. Because quite often that move is so slow that it's imperceptible. And then suddenly you end up with Dolly the sheep. Suddenly cloning in the 90s went from a thing in the science fiction stories and something that you read about in the biology textbook to there is an actual breathing animal there, and reproductive cloning might be an actual thing. And the response was, of course, quite universal. Government immediately instituted a lot of rules prohibiting reproductive cloning in human. Rules and laws that are instituted in a panic or with a strong feeling of urgency are quite often not quality laws. They're quite often based on what you imagine the technology, which is still not ready for doing anything, is going to do. And that is usually based on imaginations, those fictions that we were playing around with earlier. And we probably should try to see if we can be a bit more proactive about at least thinking about questions that predictably are going to become relevant. It seems that many authorities in society, and especially kind of Swedish government agency, have a wait-and-see approach. Okay, this is not a common practice. It's strange. We don't know much about it. Let's wait until it's a problem. And sometimes that is the rational approach. There are quite a lot of things in the world that never become a problem, or when they become a problem, it's reasonable to make a law that handles it. Because by that point, we're also getting more information. Acting, before you have information, you might have a great freedom to act, as Colin Ridge pointed out, but you don't know how you ought to be acting. By the point where you have all the information, now you might be locked in. There might be practices in place, there might be incumbents, we might have a system that is very hard to change. But now you're regretting not changing it earlier. So wait and see means letting something happen. On the other hand, it can also sometimes delay it. Because if there is no support for something, that might also mean that it's hard to get scientific funding, it's hard to get access to data, it's hard to build organizations. It's hard for the organizations to learn the right things. Quite a bit is about finding that right balance of being proactive. That is kind of why I try to get this meeting together, because I do think together here in this room we have an enormous amount of knowledge and interest in getting the interface between cryonics and society, between our institutions and new technology right, or at least better. It doesn't have to be perfect in order to be useful. In general, when we think about the institutions, cryonics poses two interesting dimensions. One is that cryonics is about building institutions that might need to exist for a very long time. This is relatively rare. When we start our research projects or in the companies or institutes, we rarely want to think about when they're going to end. Of course, research grants have an end point typically, but we try to forget that it's only 3 years and then we need to hand in the papers. But generally, of course, any company has a half-life of about 20 years. And in many domains, startups are, of course, have an even higher infant mortality. And institutions don't last very long. The states don't last that long. We don't know how long a cryonics organization need to last in order for medicine to advance. I'm rather optimistic. I don't think we need to wait that many decades, but it could be centuries. We know that states can survive for centuries, but maybe cryonics needs more time. And building deliberately an institution that lasts for a long time seems to be a worthwhile endeavor on its own. We might want to have institutions that act as societal memories that ensures that knowledge is not lost, that we don't forget where we buried the nuclear waste or the heavy metals. So here there is an interesting, again, future-oriented question. Can you design an organization like that? Or do you just have to hope for the best and hope that every generation of person in the organization cares enough about their patients in the care, cares enough to keep the organization going, and have the skills and luck to do that? But there is another aspect, of course, that's perhaps even more obvious, and that is cryonics also poses interesting challenge for different institutions. The healthcare system needs to interface with outside organizations at present that are doing something somewhat strange. In the past, there have been problems when cryonics patients have doctors that don't want to sign off on the death in a timely manner, which means that they deteriorate before the suspension. There are complications in the freedom of movement in the European Union, not for living people, but for dead people. It turns out that in order to travel as a dead person in Europe, it's not just that you need to have the right passport, you need to have the right kind of casket, etc. And this doesn't work very well with cryonics. It's a bureaucratic rule that nobody cares deeply about. There is no modern, strong reason why it has to be this way, but there is also no political push for changing that. Similarly, we might think about funerals. How do we handle the death in the future? How do we handle cryonic funerals? I have friends who deanimated, and it's an interesting question. Is this going to be a funeral because he's dead, or is he just currently dead? In the case of my friend Peter, I'm having this awkward situation that we have unfinished academic papers together. Do I finish the paper? And then hopefully in the future, when he's revived, he gets to see what I did and how I messed up our line of reasoning. Or should I wait for him? That's weird. It's also a bit unclear. Should he be co-authored with a little note that is currently suspended and not communicating? Then in some cases, these are small practical questions. When I got married, my vow to my husband ends till death do us part temporarily. And my husband, being a lawyer, pointed out, of course, that, well, legally, marriage ends when one of the parties died, but I'm willing to give you a second chance, Anders. And I think that was a very nice response, not just because I love him, but it also shows that we can be flexible about it. Many of the rules and institutions we have seem to be impossible to change. But actually, they have been made quite often in living memory, and then we quickly forget that we had a debate about the definition of death. It was kind of concluded, but that doesn't mean that it's now set eternally in stone. We could redo it if needed. And similarly, many of the traditions we have about death and life are based on an understanding of what they're supposed to be or what we commonly find them to be. But we have changed the shape of life already. We invented the teenagers in the 1950s because the people spent longer time getting educated and finding the role in society. And that produced a need for a new category of people, which now extends up to the 35 or something like that when you finally move out away from your parents' flat. Similarly, we live longer, but now we might also have that our life might be delayed. We might get a ledge on that staircase of life that you find in a lot of these Dali Carlian pictures. And that might lead to an unknown destination. To many people, this is very threatening. It's hard enough to recognize that we're mortal. And then we come up with some practical solution for living our life. Maybe ignoring it, maybe religion, maybe some existential pose. And then comes some crazy techie and starts kicking at the foundations a little bit and say, yeah, we have a thing that could fix this. Many people get very upset about that. Even good news in life extension, quite a lot of people start saying, no, I want to have my ill health. I really want my Alzheimer's. It's kind of surprising because people rarely do that about normal things. And what we're actually saying is, of course, not, I really want to get Alzheimer's or cancer. It's, I have this equilibrium. I have a model of how the world ought to be. And you're challenging that in a way that I find somewhat inappropriate. Then, of course, me being a bit of a philosopher means that I'm just going to keep on probing and being inappropriate and annoying. But that's a separate thing. I think cryonics is a good example of how our societies will need to deal with the options and changes in how we structure our lives. Maybe they're not going to be super radical. Many of them are smaller, like the teenagers. But I think there's important questions here. And I want to invite you all to a wide-ranging conversation of figuring out how to do this right. Well, that was what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.